Hey everybody. In this short mini lecture, I'm going to talk to you about Gregor Mendel. So Gregor Mendel is actually, his real name was Johann Mendel. But when he became an Augustinian monk, you take on a saint's name, and he picked Gregor. Why did he become a monk, you ask? Because he really liked education. He had an aspiration to become a high school teacher. So he went to school to become a high school teacher, but he kept failing the orals. So, which is a problem. So, okay, well, let me back up a little bit. So Gregor Mendel was born onto his family farm. He had an older sister and a younger sister. And this family farm had belonged to his family for 130 years. That's a long time. That's a lot of tradition and history breathing down your back. But they always struggled financially to make it. They didn't quite have enough money. And he was living in to a German family or a Czech family. I can never remember if it was German or Czech. And it doesn't really matter. But because it was part of the Austrian Empire. But whatever it was either a German living in a Czech place or Czech living in a German place, but whatever, his languages didn't match up. And he really loved to study stuff. He loved to study astronomy and meteorology and biology, and he went to all sorts of various schools, and was, of course, surprising no one, and unlike Darwin, was a very good student, except for that he couldn't pass the orals because his language skills weren't all that great. And this got to be a problem. Hang on just a second. This is like bad form. Like, are you recording me? Checking my cell phone. It's fine. Let's see. So we've got Gregor Mendel here. He grew up on this family farm. They struggled for money. He wanted to go to school. He really, really wanted to be a high school teacher. He did not want anything to do with farming. It was too stressful. He thought it was always stressful, worrying about having enough money. So the poor kid gets into, okay, as a farmer, before we talk about his trajectory here, as a kid, he learned gardening, which is important because you see him gardening in these pictures, and beekeeping, also a funny story. Okay, so here he is. He loves physics and astronomy and all these crazy math things. The guy was good at math, unlike our friend Darwin, and loved math and was really good at math. So he gets into this school. If he can pass the whole program, he can become a certified high school teacher. He passes the first part of the exam, passes the second part of the exam. Third part is the orals. Okay, so then his friends and professors realize that this guy is super smart, so they send him to a better school, and they're like, work on your language skills, man. And so it's essentially the equivalent to a university. And he passes the first part and the second part, but still fails the third part. So this is a guy who and how is he paying for this, right? Because school is expensive in the 1800s, even if you are living in Europe in the 1800s. So his younger sister, Teresa, gave up her dowry for him to go to school. I mean, that is a gift from the heart, right? That's your sister watching out for you. But he sent her 3 or 4 kids to school, and they all became financial successes. I can't remember. They became doctors or lawyers or something. I actually think doctors. So he held up his end. It was a good investment on her part, but what a good family, right? So as he's going through his second round of schooling, and he clearly has a passion for this, for learning, one of his professors says, well, listen, if you go into if you become religious, if you become a religious person, then you get your education paid for. And he's like, okay, I will become a monk. And I'm going to talk about what he did as a monk for a minute. After, I'm going to skip over why he's making this talk. Sorry, I'm speaking Klingon. I'm going to skip over the part where he does his science, because we're going to focus on that. But so he says, okay, I'll become a monk. He becomes a good monk. He's a good monk. And he never has his own kids, but he invests in his sister's kids. And he's monk. And then he becomes abbot. Okay, abbot is the leader of the monks. So like if you got a monastery, the guy in charge of all the monks is the abbot. And he becomes an abbot. And as he's an abbot, he gets really involved in this argument with the state about taxation. I can't imagine. Actually, I can, because in academia, I will tell you, like you're doing all this great research, and then you get called into service and you become a dean or something, and then all your research goes by the wayside and you're caught up in the minutia and things like taxation or pedagogies or whatever. I guess I worry about pedagogies, but budgets and all that stuff. My daughter has pet rats and they are cleaning each other right now. I don't know if I can show it to you. It's super cute though. The rats are cute. Okay, this is how I lecture. Like squirrel, go! Okay, let's talk about Gregor Mendel. Okay, so Gregor becomes a monk. Okay, and he's in a Augustinian monastery. And from his childhood on his farm, he knows a couple of things. He knows about gardening and he knows about beekeeping. And one of his mentors had been really interested in breeding and in passing down traits. So breeding for livestock, like not just breeding for whatever. And so Mendel, under the tutelage of his mentor, decided that he really wanted to focus on understanding the laws of inheritance. So he starts with he has a couple of funny projects before he gets to the famous ones that succeed. So let's talk about some of the failures. He first started with mice. And the abbot, who was the abbot when he first started, is like, you can't be studying mouse sex, man. That's just unseemly for a monk. Stop with the mouse sex. So he stops with the mouse breeding program. And his favorite animal were the bees. And actually, I forget the name of it, but the kind of bees he liked were sort of aggressive bees. And the other brothers in the other monks in the monastery were like, could you not with those bees? Just use honeybees, man. And he's trying to study the laws of inheritance with his bees. And there are a bunch of problems with this idea. First of all, like mice, you can tell apart. Like even if you think all mice look alike, you could like dye their tails or something like that. But bees really do. I sound like a bee racist. All bees look alike. Okay, that's a problem. And then problem number two is that, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, a baby bee gets not 50% of its genes from its mom and 50% of its genes from its dad, but 75% from its mom and 25% from its dad, which means that the math is funky. And so the bees didn't work very well as a model organism to study inheritance. And then this poor guy, then the guy did some experiments with a plant called hawksweed, like hawk and weed. Come up with your own emoji for that. So he's studying hawksweed and he just can't get the numbers to line up, man. Like he has this hypothesis he's testing, which I'll get to, but he can't get it to line up. And so he gave up, didn't publish on that. Little did he know that hawksweed is one of the few plants that just generally produces asexually. And so that you were never going to get 50-50. And then he landed on the pea plant. Okay, which is of course what he's famous for. But did you know this fun fact? To get his data, he only published one paper, and it's in German. That made it fun to read. Um, to get his data, he bred 28,000 plants. 28,000. I mean, just 28,000 plants. I mean, can you just imagine how much time that took? How much dedication? And he's sitting there and he's measuring, like, I don't know, 7 traits, not that many traits, but let's say 7 times 28,000. God, so crazy. So it's funny. So there's this statistician named Ari Fisher who tried to replicate Mendel's studies. And he's like, nah, it's bullshit. The stuff doesn't line up. The numbers don't line up. And then Hurdle, I can't remember his first name. Then another geneticist took a look at his data and he said, Fisher, man, you're full of shit. His numbers clearly line up. And one of the reasons that his numbers line up is because he had 28,000 replicates, but also he had spent a lot of time failing at things, like failing. Anybody who's worked in the Warren Lab knows that you have to run a project many times before you start getting an answer. But one of the ways that he honed in on traits that I said that there were 7, and wrinkled, smooth, the shape of the seed, the color. Color is an easy one because you can see it without having to measure anything. And then the traits that he picked are coded for by one gene, right? The gene has 2 flavors only. Okay, so let's talk about what traits those might be. So generally in humans, we tend to think that eye color is like, you can use a Punnett square and predict eye color if you know mom's eye color and dad's eye color. And certainly if you know grandparents' eye color, you know what the probability if you mix blue eyes with brown eyes, what the probability of blue and brown are. But the fact is that eye color is not so great because eye color, which is like one of the simplest traits that we have as humans, is coded for by about 30 genes. Height, for example, is coded for by like 2,000 genes. There's a lot of genes. Whether or not you have a widow's peak, that is actually coded for by 1 gene. But it's hard you don't see a whole lot of widow's peaks out there. So one of the things that Mendel did was he focused on all of these replicates, and then these genes, these traits that are coded for by 1 gene. And all of that work paid off because he was able to really laid down laws of inheritance. He was really interested in being able to articulate the laws of inheritance. His paper, he only had 1 paper. So he only had 1 paper. He only gave 1 presentation. There were maybe 40 important scientists at the talk that he gave. And it was a poorly understood talk. Now, people like to debate why it was poorly understood. I have my own hypothesis. My hypothesis is this: he was relying on math. He's working at a time where in biology, math is not a thing. We get to math being a thing in biology in the beginning of the 1900s, and not even like the very beginning of the 1900s. I'm talking like the 1920s and 30s. Certainly by the 1940s, math and biology were friends, but Darwin didn't do math. And the thing is that if you put Darwin's idea together with Mendel's idea, and I'm leaving poor Wallace out of here, if we put Wallace and Darwin and Mendel together, we have modern biology. But as you're going to see later on, like 50 or 60 years go by between the publication of Mendel and the putting together, the melding of Darwinian science and Mendelian genetics. We don't get that for 50 or 60 years after he publishes. And we're going to talk about that in the next couple of slides. But the rumor is that when our friend Chuck died of old age, there was a copy of Mendel's paper in his desk. But that the rumor is that Darwin never read it. Now, what you know about Darwin, if he picked up that paper and it was in German and it was in math, do you think he would have read it? No. Darwin was not a fan of math, and languages weren't his skill set either. Okay, so Mendel had all of these, he did all these experiments. He had just reams and reams of notebooks. And he died at the age of 61 of kidney disease. He had been struggling with kidney illness for his whole life. So he dies of nephritis. And we have nothing left of his notebooks because the new abbot burned all of his notebooks. And contrary to popular belief, he did not burn them because he hated science, because I'm going to say Catholic, but I hope you realize that I mean Protestant and Lutheranism, all the European versions of Christianity, all of those monks, like Franciscans, they specialize in education. So education and religion didn't get separated until that's an American flavor of religion. So in Europe at the time, education and religion often went together. England did some weird shit with it. And of course, the abbot thought that mouse sex was untasteful. So, I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen a mouse testicle. They're pretty big. Maybe he had a point. I don't maybe you're thinking too much about it if you're thinking about mouse sex being unseemly. I would think you're thinking too much about it. Nonetheless, so Mendel dies at the age of 61. All of his notes are burned. So we don't have like all of his study on the bees and all of his study with the hawksweed. We don't have them anything anymore because the abbot, I hope I said this part, that the new abbot burned his paperwork because of the taxation issue. When Mendel died, he had been working on this taxation issue, arguing with the state about taxation. And he had reams and reams of notes about taxation. And the incoming abbot didn't want any of that argument to be held against his monastery. And so he burned it all to make sure that the taxation issue didn't get saved. So burned it, yes, not because he hated science, but because he didn't want the taxation thing to come and bite him on his ass. Okay, so what did Mendel's work with the peas show us? What did we learn from that? Now, I told you that what Gregor wanted to do was talk about understand the laws of inheritance. He was super keen on understanding the laws of inheritance. And so what did we get for him? So Mendel's fascination with understanding the laws of inheritance was something that a lot of people were thinking of at the time. Gregor's mentor was working on this stuff. And in fact, when Gregor gave his talk about the laws of inheritance, his talk was misunderstood as a talk about hybridization, which wasn't where he was going with that. Okay, so Darwin had already written a book about, because Darwin and Wallace were very clear that from the strong laws of inheritance, right? The laws of inheritance they wanted to know about it. But Darwin had written a paper or a book, I can't remember now which, that said that traits are passed down in blended forms. So, every once in a while you'll see something like on Yahoo News, they'll say, by 20 and 50 years, there'll be no more blondes. And when you're assuming there are going to be no more blondes, it's just what they're just assuming is that sex is going to make everything blend. And okay, it doesn't show a very good understanding of how genetics work. Darwin thought that if you took a fast horse and a slow horse and you bred them together, you were going to get a medium paced horse, medium speeded horse. Where, okay, now that's speed is a bad example because I'm sure it's controlled for by many traits, but let's assume that it's controlled for by one trait. So what Mendel would say is, sure, it's speed, you take fast and slow and you breed them together, you might get medium, but sometimes you're going to get fast and sometimes you're going to get slow and sometimes you're going to get medium. It isn't that you get an average, it's that you get a distribution. Okay, so the real thing that Mendel was able to show is that traits are passed down in packets. And we call these packets genes, but Mendel didn't call them genes. We didn't start calling them genes until, it's funny, Wikipedia says that we get that from Fisher, but that's not exactly true. Nobody knows exactly who coined the word genes and genetics. But we do know that it showed up with the botanists. The plant people were talking about it, and a number of authors started using the words genes and genetics at the same time. So we don't actually have an attribution, or rather, Wikipedia says that Fisher did it, but I don't think that's correct. Far be it from me to argue with Wikipedia, however. Regardless, Mendel did not give us the word genes, although when we talk about genetics, we call Mendel the father of genetics. Okay, so Mendel gave us this idea that we get half our genes from our mom and half our genes from our dad, and that genes are passed down as unique things, not a blending of things. Okay, that's everything you needed to know about Mendel. And I hope you think he's cool now, because I think he's damn cool. All right, I know that sounds like it's over, but it's not, because I'm going to segue into the modern synthesis. So the modern synthesis, I've got ahead of myself here. The modern synthesis happened. So we had Mendel, and he's publishing in 1865, 1866. It is not until 1937, 1942 that we get Dobzhansky, Huxley, and Ernst Mayr reading Mendel and understanding Mendel, and understanding that Mendel and Darwin, those concepts go together in the same pile. Okay, and we call that, now we can go to the next slide, theoretically. So we call this the modern synthesis. Also called neo-Darwinism. I know I'm going to laugh about this in a minute. So the modern synthesis, or neo-Darwinism, is the concept you get when you put Wallace and Darwin's ideas together with Mendel's ideas. Whoa! Modern synthesis. I'm not going to lie, this is funny. This is the kind of nerd your professor is. I have gone to not one, but 2 dinner parties in the last few years where, over a bottle of wine, my nerdy friends and I, all biologists, all evolutionary biologists, will argue about, okay, the modern synthesis happened in the 1940s. It's time for a new modern synthesis. What are we going to add to it? Okay, what I'm adding to it, you guys can pick your own. I picked the platypus for the most cool. Here's what I'm picking for the modern synthesis. I would add epigenetics. I would bring my friend Lamarck right back into this argument, and I would say that the ability of the environment to impact the methylation of genes, to say which ones are turned on and which ones are turned off, is an important understanding, because essentially Lamarck can be right and is sometimes right. Okay, so that's the new modern synthesis via Pochron. That's just my take on it. It's not in a textbook. It's not in Wikipedia. Okay, so let me give you in actual words, not Klingon, what the modern synthesis is and what neo-Darwinism is. It's applying Mendelian genetics, okay, which is just this idea that genes are packets and you inherit packets, not a blend. Um, you apply Mendelian genetics to natural selection, a la Darwin and Wallace, to get a better understanding of how evolution works. Okay. Okay. I'll see you guys later.